It begins not with fire, not with war, not with the fall of a king or the birth of a prophet. It begins with something smaller, something invisible, something that should have changed everything, but didn't. October 1346. The Crimean Peninsula. On the edge of the Black Sea, the Genoese outpost of Kaffa stands tense silent. Inside the walls, merchants murmur prayers in half a dozen languages: Italian, Greek, Arabic, Armenian, as arrows clatter against their ramparts. Outside, the great horde of Yani Beg Khan of the Golden Horde has laid siege. The Mongols have encircled the city for months. Supplies dwindle. The water tastes stale. Inside, the stench of desperation lingers in the alleys, but then, something else arrives. At first, it's barely noticeable. A Mongol soldier collapses by the campfire. They think it's exhaustion. Days later, more fall. Their skin blackens, boils rise beneath their arms, their breath smells of rot. Panic spreads through the tents faster than any arrow ever could. The Mongols don't know it, but the plague has found them. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium so small that 1,000,000 could fit on the head of a pin, has infected their lines, riding on fleas, riding on rats, riding on breath. In our history, Yani Beg responds with horror and fury. He orders his catapults to hurl plague-ridden corpses over the city walls. A primitive form of biological warfare. The disease enters Kaffa, infects the Genoese, and soon after, sails across the sea to Sicily. From there, it devours Europe. But not this time. In this version of history, the wind changes. A coastal storm crashes in from the north. The Mongol siege engines are destroyed overnight, their ammunition, the plague corpses, washed out to sea. Yani Beg, fearful that his army may be cursed, lifts the siege, and as his troops vanish into the steppes, they take the pestilence with them. Kaffa breathes again. The Genoese ships set sail for home, but this time they carry silk and spices, not death. Europe never knows what it escaped. Messina 1347. In our world, this Sicilian port would be the gateway for the apocalypse. Genoese ships would have docked with dead men at the oars and sickness in the hold. The locals would have screamed and cursed them back to sea, but it would be too late. Within months, Florence would lose 60% of its people. London the same. Entire monasteries would fall silent. Orphans would starve beside their mothers' corpses. But not here. The Europe of this timeline remains noisy, smelly, vibrant, overcrowded, and alive. It marches toward the mid-14th century as it always had, slowly, feudal, confused. The church still holds sway, though the papacy is split between Rome and Avignon. Monarchs still feud over claims of land and legitimacy. The 100 Years' War simmers, not yet boiling. The common people still scratch the earth for grain and coins with little hope of rising. Nothing seems to change, but the absence of death will soon become its own kind of presence. By 1350, the world population is soaring. In our history, the Black Death culled over 75 million people worldwide, 25 million in Europe alone. Entire villages vanished. The workforce collapsed. Serfs demanded wages. Landowners begged for help. The rigid order of medieval life cracked, but not in this world. Here the fields stay full. The manors remain staffed. No inheritance is suddenly available. No mass graves become land for the taking. Peasants remain peasants. Lords remain lords, and the ancient brittle structure of feudalism holds. But even as life appears stable, something underneath is shifting. Too many mouths, not enough bread. In this version of the 1350s, famine strikes with quiet vengeance. Bad harvests that would have gone unnoticed in our timeline now trigger food riots. Paris, overpopulated and filthy, sees bread lines stretch for blocks. London's alleys overflow with the unwanted, second sons, surplus daughters, the sickly, the strange. In the fields of Flanders, a child watches his younger sister die, not from disease but from malnutrition. In a world too stable to flex and too crowded to care, this is the paradox of a world without plague. It is alive, but it is not well, and then comes the reaction, not from the people but from the powers above. The church, sensing unrest, tightens its grip. In our world, the plague had shattered faith. Priests died, bishops fled, and the people questioned God's silence. From that vacuum came mysticism, heresy, and eventually, Reformation. Here, the church never flees, never falters, never learns. It grows more powerful and more repressive. In 1357, Pope Innocent VI issues a new edict, Licentia Fiducia, an aggressive enforcement of orthodoxy. Heretical groups like the Waldensians are crushed. Local mystics are burned not because they spread disease, but because they threaten order. The arts stagnate, the guilds remain gatekeepers, and the Renaissance waits. Florence 1370. A man named Francesco Petrarca, known to us as Petrarch, still lives. He still writes sonnets, but he does not write in mourning, because in our world it was plague that shaped him. Death made him question the fragility of life, of empire, of time. His sonnets were elegies. In this world they are flatter, less urgent. His letters are scholarly, but safe. He does not spark a revival. He writes and is forgotten. The 14th century rolls on, uneventful in the eyes of kings, but heavy for the common folk. The average lifespan rises, but so does suffering. Laborers toil longer, children are born more frequently, but opportunity does not multiply, because the land is already taken, because the guild's already full, because the system once stretched by death remains intact and unbending. And then comes the long freeze. In 1386, the Little Ice Age strikes with severity. In our timeline, the population decline from the Black Death softened its blow. Fewer mouths meant more grain. More land meant options. Here the population never declined. So the freeze is devastating. Crops fail across Scandinavia. Norway enters a full famine. Denmark cuts off exports. In the Holy Roman Empire, hundreds of villages dissolve under snow and hunger. And with no pandemic to blame, people look elsewhere. They look to strangers, to outsiders, to the other. Anti-Semitic violence spikes. Pogroms sweep through Bavaria and Alsace. Accusations of well poisoning return. Not because of plague, but because of panic. In Nuremberg, entire Jewish quarters are set ablaze, not in 1349 as in our world, but in 1391, triggered by famine and inflation, not pestilence. The scapegoats remain the same. The cause changes, but the fear is constant. So what is Europe in 1400? It is full, overripe, unbroken by death and thus never rebuilt. Its cities crowd toward the sky, stacking misery in tenements with no names. Its villages suffocate under obligation. Its rulers rule longer and harder. The Renaissance has not bloomed. The printing press has not yet sparked. Science sleeps under the weight of tradition. And still the plague has not come, but the rats still exist, and the ships still sail, and time does not forget. The year is 1415. Europe, unbroken by plague, stands tall, but not wiser. The structures that should have collapsed under the weight of death remain intact. Castles still cast their shadows over starving villages. Bishops still rule more by fear than by faith. The merchant class is growing, yes, but not exploding. Because there was no disruption, no redistribution, no moment of collapse that forced society to rebuild. Instead, the old world simply continued. And beneath its stone facade, pressure builds. In our history, the early 15th century saw strange stirrings, proto-revolutions of the spirit and mind. Jan Hus in Bohemia, reformers in Oxford, mystics in Rhineland forests. They were driven in part by disillusionment, by the question that echoed after plague. If God allowed such death, what does that say about power, about the church, about the soul? But in this alternate path, no such question arises, because the trauma never came. Jan Hus still preaches in Prague, but he is silenced faster. There is no groundswell of followers grieving their dead, no spiritual vacuum begging to be filled. He is labeled a dissenter, tried swiftly, and burned in 1412. 5 years earlier than in our world, the Hussite Wars never begin. The Holy Roman Empire remains stable, ironclad in its authority. The tinder for revolution is swept away before it can ignite. Meanwhile, the Ottoman threat grows. The Byzantine Empire, still clinging to Constantinople, is even weaker than in our world, not because of plague, but because of neglect. Without the chaos of the Black Death, Europe never learned to consolidate, never learned to fear extinction. Its armies are bloated, traditional, proud. In 1420, the Ottomans surround Constantinople. By 1422, they breach it. But this conquest doesn't shock Europe the way it should. In our history, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 reverberated through Christendom. It sent Greek scholars fleeing westward with ancient texts. It helped spark the Renaissance. It awakened a sense of global competition, a race for power beyond the Holy Land. Here, Constantinople falls quietly. There is no diaspora of philosophers, no influx of Greek into Italian universities, no urgency to rediscover Aristotle or Plato. The Renaissance remains a whisper, a minor artistic movement, not a rebirth. Florence remains wealthy, of course. The Medici still rise, but they rule a city obsessed with preserving status, not pursuing genius. Brunelleschi builds his dome, but is never recognized as a revolutionary. Donatello sculpts, but remains in commission to the church, never challenging its narratives. And Leonardo da Vinci, he is never born. His ancestors never gained enough independence from guild control to pursue art. Their line ends in obscurity. The age of discovery is still coming, but it comes from desperation, not wonder. In the courts of Portugal and Spain, noble houses swell with younger sons. Inheritance laws keep them landless. The church offers no room for ambition, and so they look outward. Prince Henry the Navigator still sponsors expeditions along the African coast, but he is not a visionary. He is an exile, a second son with nothing to gain at home. He funds ships not for glory, but for gold. Portuguese caravels touch down on the shores of West Africa in 1430. By 1440 they return with human cargo. The transatlantic slave trade begins earlier in this world, because there are more people in Europe, more mouths to feed, more competition, and fewer alternatives. Africa is not seen as a mystery, but as a mine, a resource, and with no Renaissance to temper their worldview, no Erasmus, no Montaigne, no Thomas More, the moral framework for conquest is brutal, pragmatic, cynical. The other is not misunderstood. They are reduced. By 1450, Europe is a continent of ambition without introspection, a civilization that survived because it never faced itself, and that makes it dangerous. Then, in 1472, something unexpected happens. A Venetian trader returns from the Levant with a book, not a religious text, not a scroll of war, but a strange mathematical manuscript written in ancient Arabic, a relic from the scholars of Baghdad. The treatise is on navigation by the stars. It reaches Lisbon. Within a decade it will change the world, because while Europe may be inwardly stagnant, its greed is not, and that greed demands expansion. By 1480, new maps are being drawn. By 1487, Bartholomew Dias rounds the Cape of Good Hope. By 1492, just as in our world, a Genoese sailor named Columbus sails westward under the banner of Castile and Aragon. But this time he is not alone. 3 more expeditions leave within weeks of his departure. Portugal, France, Venice. A race begins. The New World is not discovered, it is descended upon. Conquest without conscience, trade without balance, and disease. Disease follows. In our world, the Europeans who reached the Americas carried pathogens their bodies had long coexisted with. Smallpox, measles, influenza. The native populations had no resistance. But in this alternate timeline where the Black Death never ravaged Europe, immune systems are different. Less hardened, the pandemics of 17th century Europe will not be survivable. But now it is the native peoples who endure longer, and the balance of conquest begins to wobble. Back in Europe something stirs. Because even without the plague, even without the Renaissance, even without Luther's firebrand sermons, people begin to notice that something is wrong. The peasant in Normandy starves, even though the fields are full. A blacksmith in Prague watches his son drafted into a war he doesn't understand. A merchant in Florence wonders why the roads are full of gold, but the hospitals are full of death. The question begins to echo, not loudly, but it echoes. Why is the world like this? And in the shadows another question follows. What if it had been allowed to break? The year is 1517. In our timeline, this is the moment Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, a spark that ignites centuries of religious upheaval. Protest, reform, rebellion. It begins not because Luther is radical, but because Europe is ready. The world had changed. The plague had broken the back of feudalism. Faith was cracked open by trauma. People were hungry for answers that the church could no longer give. But in this alternate world, things are different. Luther still writes, but no one listens. The church remains dominant, not only spiritually, but politically, economically, and militarily. With no Black Death to weaken its infrastructure, it remains unshaken. Priests didn't flee during plague years because there were no plague years. Bishops didn't die in droves. The institution was never humbled. And so when Luther dares to question indulgences, when he suggests that salvation may not be bought or sold, he is not challenged in debate, he is arrested, his writings burned, his students silenced. There is no Reformation, no Protestantism, no fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire. The printing press exists. It was developed by Gutenberg, still inspired by the need to distribute religious texts more widely, but it does not flood Europe with tracts and pamphlets of rebellion. Instead, it is controlled. Monopolized by the church and royal courts, most citizens will never read a page that hasn't been approved. Religion remains centralized. Faith is not questioned, it is imposed, but repression has its consequences. By the mid-1500s, the monarchies of Europe are bursting with gold, especially Spain. The conquest of the New World is well underway. The Aztec Empire in this timeline took nearly 2 decades to fall, not one. But fall it did. Not to a small band of conquistadors, but to thousands, reinforced, supplied, and coordinated with brutal efficiency. Silver pours into Seville, sugar flows from the Caribbean, slaves are shipped from West Africa in chains of iron and silence. The economy swells, but it does not distribute. In our timeline, the loss of so much life after the plague triggered a rebalancing. Workers became valuable, land changed hands, new classes emerged. But here, the elite hold everything. Peasants till the land, slaves till the colonies. And above them all, kings and cardinals dine on gold. In France, tension simmers. There is no Huguenot movement, no Calvinist wave, but there is resentment. The tax burden on the poor deepens, the aristocracy grows decadent, the church collects tithe after tithe, and then in 1562 a comet streaks across the night sky, a sign? No, but people believe it is. And belief is everything. Mass hysteria erupts in Toulouse. Thousands gather in the streets, convinced the world is ending. The church sends priests to calm them, but they are stoned, burned. Riots break out, not against doctrine, but against despair. People aren't rejecting God. They're rejecting the silence of their suffering. Meanwhile, in England, the Tudor dynasty takes shape. But without the Protestant break, Henry VIII never separates from Rome. His marriages are sanctioned. The papacy grants concessions fearing revolt, and Elizabeth is never born. There is no Anglican church, no Shakespeare, no Marlowe, no explosion of Elizabethan drama shaped by a country navigating its own identity. Instead, England remains Catholic, insular, controlled. Its navy never dominates, its colonies never multiply, and so the age of empire belongs to Iberia, and eventually to France. Portugal controls the east, Spain controls the west, France expands in Africa, seeing the interior not as wilderness, but as providence, and with no reformation to divide Christendom, a new ideology emerges to justify domination, the doctrine of divine stability. It claims God prevented the Great Plague for a reason. Europe was spared to bring order to the world. This is the philosophical cornerstone of conquest in this timeline. It is not merely greed, it is a mission, civilization, framed not as enlightenment, but as enforcement, the sword not just as tool, but as sacred calling. In the Americas, resistance continues. The Inca Empire holds longer than in our timeline. Their mountainous geography and resilient political structure delay conquest for over 60 years. Spanish losses are enormous. The jungle becomes a grave for entire divisions. But the resistance is not enough. Guns, steel, and germs still win, even if differently. Cities fall, temples burn, languages vanish. But with less immunity to Old World disease than in our timeline, the invaders begin to suffer as well. A mysterious fever sweeps through Spanish garrisons in 1593. It kills thousands, and it cannot be explained. The equilibrium of conquest begins to shift. Back in Europe, cracks form in other ways. Art begins to change, not in volume, but in tone. Without the Renaissance's embrace of humanism, painting remains bound to the sacred, but the images grow darker, not dramatic but oppressive. Saints depicted not in ecstasy, but in agony. Martyrs everywhere. Beauty is defined by obedience. In Rome, the church commissions a series of colossal frescoes designed to depict the unbroken order. A historical narrative of divine continuity, it is a masterpiece and a warning. Doubt is treason, but not everyone believes. In 1599, an astronomer in Krakow observes an anomaly in the orbit of Mars. He suspects the Earth is not the center of the universe. His name is Mikołaj Wronski. A humble student, unremarkable. He writes his calculations carefully, quietly, and hides them, not because he fears contradiction, but because he knows this world is not ready for truth, and so the Enlightenment stalls before it can begin. Europe enters the 1600s as an empire of structure, not thought, of conquest, not questioning, and even as it spreads across oceans and continents, it remains fragile, because deep down its foundations were never challenged and never tested, never shattered and rebuilt. And the people, the ones untouched by plague yet scarred by stagnation, begin to ask quietly, dangerously, is this the world we were spared for? The year is 1601. A new century begins, but there is no celebration in the streets of Madrid, Paris, or Prague, no fireworks, no feeling of Renaissance. Instead there is smoke, exhaustion, murmurs of fear, because even without the Black Death, Europe has become sick, not with plague, not yet, but with pressure. For centuries this world avoided collapse, avoided the great mortality that humbled kings and starved cities, but in doing so, it also avoided something else, reinvention. Now the weight of that decision is beginning to show. In Paris, the streets are choked with people, not just the poor, but the forgotten, laborers without land, orphans without homes, soldiers without war. The wars of conquest in the New World have enriched the crown but drained the country, and with no Protestant Reformation to divide and decentralize power, the French monarchy remains unchecked, bloated, arrogant, and insulated. Louis XIII ascends the throne at the age of 9, surrounded by a court obsessed with ritual, order, and secrecy. The people chant his name, but they do not believe in it. They believe in bread, and they are running out. In this timeline, the so-called Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of cooling that in our world was catastrophic but manageable, becomes something else entirely. A death sentence. Because Europe is overpopulated, With no plague to thin its numbers, no pandemics to reduce density, every failed harvest becomes a national crisis. In 1602, a grain shortage in Saxony triggers the first pan-German food riot in recorded memory. By winter, the unrest has spread to Bavaria. Armed peasants storm a grain storage facility in Nuremberg and are met with cannon fire. The Holy Roman Empire declares martial law, not against an enemy, but against its own people. In the north, Sweden wages a brutal war with Denmark over Baltic trade routes. The war lasts 5 years longer than in our timeline because both nations can field larger armies. But they are not stronger, just more desperate. When peace is finally signed in 1612, neither side celebrates. Half their populations are starving, half their cities are in ruin. The Baltic Sea becomes a grave, and then comes the firestorm. The 30 Years' War begins in 1618, just as it did in our timeline. But the causes are different, not religion, for there is no Protestantism, not faith, for there is no competing vision of salvation. This time it begins with politics. In Bohemia, a Catholic aristocrat demands hereditary control over a Protestant-leaning province, not out of ideology but greed. The local lords resist. They don't believe in Luther. They don't even know who he is, but they know tyranny when they see it. Sparks fly, and within months the empire mobilizes troops, not to save the soul of Christendom, but to crush autonomy. This war is not about belief, it is about control. And that makes it worse, because in our timeline, some soldiers fought with passion. Here, they fight for pay. Mercenaries flood the fields of Central Europe. Men who owe no allegiance to king or creed only coin. Villages burn, women vanish, children starve. But unlike the plague, this horror has a face. It rides a horse, it carries a pike, and it answers to no one. By 1625, there is no longer a clear front line. Entire regions are lawless, and for the first time in centuries, the people of Europe look at one another and ask, was the death we avoided worse than the one we invited? And then, nature answers. A new illness emerges in the slums of Naples. At first, it seems like influenza, fevers, coughing, body aches, but it spreads faster and kills slower. Within weeks, it is in Rome. By spring, it reaches Marseille, then Lyon. By autumn, it is in Prague and Paris. This is not the Black Death. This is something new, and in this timeline, one without centuries of exposure, immunity, or memory, the body does not know how to fight. The church declares a state of divine emergency. The monarchs close their gates, but the contagion does not respect prayer, nor border, nor crown. By 1630, more people have died than in the first 10 years of the war, but the death is slower, creepier. It does not empty cities overnight, it rots them from within. Commerce ceases. Grain spoils on the docks, orphans sleep on cathedral steps, and the screams of the dying are drowned out not by weeping, but by silence, because there are too many, and no one left to listen. Hospitals become death camps, monasteries are overrun, priests walk among the sick, terrified not of punishment, but of irrelevance, because their prayers are not working, and in that silence something ancient stirs, philosophy, not the kind taught by clerics, but the kind whispered by gravediggers, the kind written in blood on cellar walls. A French doctor named Lucien Moreau begins documenting symptoms, not to save souls, but to understand. He is arrested, accused of witchcraft, but not before he publishes one final entry in his notes. We were spared the great fire of death, and so we never learned to rebuild. Quote, spreads illegally, quietly, in the backs of bakeries, under floorboards, scratched into wooden spoons and jailhouse walls. It is not a revolution yet, but it is a beginning. By 1645, the war ends, not in treaty, but in exhaustion. Entire cities no longer exist. The emperor retreats into his palace and does not emerge for 5 years. The pope dies surrounded by gold and silence, and the people begin to doubt, not God, but those who claim to speak for him. It has taken 3 centuries, but Europe is finally cracking, not from plague, not from ideology, but from the accumulated weight of everything it refused to question. The year is 1650. Europe has survived the war, barely. Its borders remain, but its institutions lie in ruin. The 30 Years' War, fought without faith and ended without victory, has left fields unplanted, churches abandoned, and cities skeletal. The contagion that swept through during the conflict was not the Black Death, but it might as well have been. In suffering it was equal, in psychological scars perhaps worse, and now something remarkable is happening. The silence is giving way to questions. In a dim university hall in Leiden, a student listens not to a priest, but to a physician. The man speaks not of salvation but of air, of the lungs, of unseen causes. He asks a room full of boys, if God created man to suffer, why did he give us minds built for curiosity? The boys laugh nervously. But one of them, a quiet, sickly boy named Johannes, writes the question down. He will never forget it, because across Europe something stirs, not rebellion, not revolution, but observation, the beginning of something fragile, dangerous, and new. In our timeline, the Enlightenment emerges after the chaos of the Plague and the Reformation, a response to collapse, a reconstruction of reason. In this world it is something darker. It is born not from renewal but from suffocation. Europe was never broken, so it was never rebuilt. The Enlightenment that rises now does so not with joy, but with pain. In London, a man named Thomas Hobbes publishes Leviathan, just as in our world. But the book lands differently, because this world knows Leviathans, kings who rule for 60 years without question, popes who bury scandal in golden tombs, war that kills not for purpose but for pride. Hobbes is not seen as a radical. He is seen as a mirror, and the world does not like what it sees. Elsewhere, a quiet genius in Italy begins working with glass lenses. He is not a revolutionary. He works under contract. But when he peers through his telescope, he sees something that chills him. Moons orbiting Jupiter, tiny worlds dancing around something that isn't Earth. In our timeline, Galileo challenged the church and was silenced. Here, he publishes anonymously. And still, the church bans the text. But it's too late. It circulates underground in parchment scraps, in coded symbols, in whispered lectures. The idea has escaped. The Earth is no longer the center, and for the first time in centuries, neither is God. By 1670, this alternate Europe has become a laboratory of contradictions. Science is growing but underground. Faith is brittle but enforced. The monarchs rule but with fear, and the people, once passive, now observe the world with a new lens. In Amsterdam, the first observation societies form, gatherings of thinkers, tinkerers, herbalists, midwives, and exiled priests. They do not call themselves scientists. That word has not yet been invented. They call themselves questioners, and they ask, why do the stars move the way they do? Why does the body fall ill? Why does heat rise? Why does power lie where it lies? They are not revolutionaries, not yet, but their children will be. By the end of the 17th century, empires are shifting. France under Louis XIV has become a golden prison. The Sun King builds Versailles not as a symbol of power, but as a fortress of paranoia. His court is rigid, stylized, suffocating. Even his generals wear silk to breakfast. But behind the mirrors of his palace, he keeps reports of crop failures, of secret gatherings, of books printed in the Low Countries that dare to ask if the king bleeds. In Prussia, a different model emerges. Militaristic, efficient, cold. The Enlightenment arrives in uniform, a disciplined application of order, bureaucracy, and data, census records, tax logs, birth registries. The body politic measured, weighed, and controlled. But the most terrifying shift occurs not in Europe, but across the Atlantic. The Americas, colonized early and brutally in this timeline, have become an alchemical blend of old systems and new ambition. Indigenous resistance endured longer here, and though crushed in many places, it left marks on the minds of colonists, marks of rebellion, of perspective, of doubt. In 1692, in the colony of New Angoulême, what we call New York, a philosopher named Elijah Torrance pens a pamphlet titled Of the Rights of the Forgotten. It is not a religious tract, it is a scream. He writes of native nations displaced not by fate, but by policy. He writes of African slaves marked by ink and scars, not by sin. And he writes of Europe's crime, not the spread of death, but the refusal to ever look at its reflection. The pamphlet is burned, but not before it reaches London, and Edinburgh, and the ports of Marseille, and slowly a question returns, not from the mouth of a scholar, but from the lips of a mother holding her starving child. What if the world had been allowed to break? What if the plague had come? What if the order had fallen? What if the feudal walls had crumbled under the weight of grief? What if loss had taught us grace? Instead, Europe survived untouched, and in that untouched survival it calcified. Now it can feel the cracks beneath its skin. The 1700s loom, and they will not be gentle, because the Enlightenment is no longer a candle, it is a wildfire. And fire, once lit, asks only one thing: what shall we burn first? The year is 1701. The wind shifts over Europe, but it does not carry plague. It carries ideas, whispers, pamphlets, arguments passed in dark taverns and smoky salons, not yet revolutions. But the kindling of something vast and terrible. For centuries, power was preserved under the illusion of divine order. The church guarded the soul, the crown guarded the land, and the people, denied catastrophe, were also denied transformation. But now they begin to speak, and that in this world is the most dangerous act of all. In Paris, a quiet fire burns. Not literal flames, but the fever of thought. Ideas bottled for generations begin to crack open, not with fanfare, not with gunpowder, but with sentences, with questions. A man named René Lacan publishes a treatise titled The Dust of Angels. It's banned within a week. It claims that monarchs do not rule by divine right. It suggests that the church is mortal. It wonders whether suffering is a product not of sin but of design, of poor systems, not wrathful gods. It sells 500 copies, then 5,000, then 50,000. Through back alleys, foreign presses, and memory. By 1703, Lacan is in hiding, but his words are everywhere, and they aren't alone. Across the Channel, England has evolved into something stranger than monarchy. It is not a republic, but it is not fully loyal either. Parliament has gained power, not through revolution, but through utility. England did not split from Rome because of Henry's passion or Elizabeth's flair. In this world, it remained loyal to Catholicism far longer. But after generations of distant kings and costly wars, Parliament became too useful to ignore. And now it governs through compromise. A state not of vision, but of convenience. But even convenience has limits. In the early 1700s, a series of agricultural disasters ripple through the continent. The Little Ice Age returns in fierce cycles. Wheat fails. Wine spoils in barrels. Livestock perish in frozen fields. And suddenly, the elite, the ones who have ruled unopposed for generations, remember fear. Because hungry people ask questions, and angry people demand answers. But the world's systems are not designed to give them. The Enlightenment, as it takes root in this world, is a scream into a void. There are no salons in Versailles. There are no scientific societies protected by liberal patrons. There is no Voltaire dining with aristocrats. The thinkers here are hunted. They live in shadows. They write in code. They disguise philosophy as fiction, ethics as parables, reason as myth. And yet, the people understand. Because they've been waiting for centuries for someone to put into words what they feel in their bones. That this world untouched by the Black Death has also been untouched by mercy. In Vienna, an orphan named Tobias Ehrlich writes a children's book about a kingdom where no one dies, but where everyone is assigned a number at birth. It is a fairy tale, except it isn't. The book is banned. The author disappears. But the story is told at night in kitchens and fields, and every child who hears it begins to see their world a little differently. And then, in 1741, something shatters. A riot in Lyon. At first it's about bread, always about bread, but this time when the soldiers arrive, they are met not with stones, but with structure. The mob has a leader, a name, a plan. Her name is Eliane Marchand, a former nurse, a widow, a survivor of the 1630 plague that still haunts this world like a ghost. She speaks not like a peasant, but like a prophet. She says, if our lords will not feed us, then they have no use for our lives. She says, we have been patient for 400 years, she says, let it break. The authorities laugh. Then the granaries burn. Within weeks, uprisings ripple through the Rhone Valley. They are not coordinated, but they are contagious. In Amsterdam, dockworkers go on strike. In Naples, merchants blockade royal gates. In Krakow, students refuse Mass for the first time in recorded memory. They want food, yes, but more than that, they want to breathe, to question, to rebuild something new. But the powers of this world, long unbroken, react with rage. In 1745, the Diet of the Holy Roman Empire authorizes Ordo Caelestis, the heavenly order decree. It grants full legal immunity to any noble who kills a dissenter in the name of stability. The Church blesses it. The people rebel. By 1750, Europe is on fire. But this is not our French Revolution. There is no Bastille, no declaration of the rights of man. There are no slogans, only desperation. This revolution is bloodier, more scattered, more chaotic, because there is no single ideology guiding it, no Rousseau, no Locke, no Montesquieu, only fragments, screams, flashes of clarity, and yet something emerges. In Galicia, a council of farmers drafts a charter, not a constitution, but a promise. They write, we are not kings nor angels, but we are alive. That must be enough to earn dignity. They hang it from a church door. 2 days later, the village is burned to ash, but the charter survives, and in the ashes, others begin to write. By 1760, revolution is not an event. It is a condition. Spain fractures into 4 provinces, each ruled by a different interpretation of the divine order. France loses the Loire region to anarchist communes who print currency with no monarch's face. Prussia becomes a police state. England, ever cautious, closes its ports, fearing contagion of ideas. And across the Atlantic, the colonies watch. They were born of brutality, of conquest, of stolen land and stolen labor. But now something different stirs. Not freedom, they do not yet believe in that, but agency, choice, a rejection of silence. In 1765, a group of landowners and former indentured workers in the southern colony of Carolina sign a compact. They write, the earth may not be ours, but we will not live as ghosts upon it. It is not yet independence. but it is no longer submission. Back in Europe, the wars begin, not between nations, but between futures. One world wants to restore order, the other wants to learn how to live in disorder. And so, ironically, the plague that never came has done its work. It delayed death, but it could not prevent suffering. And now all that pent-up history spills forward, not in pestilence, but in fire. The year is 1776. In our world, it was a moment of clarity. 13 colonies breaking from a distant king declaring that all men were created equal, igniting a revolution that would echo for centuries. But in this timeline, nothing is so clean. Because in this world the plague never came, Europe never bled, and because of that it never broke. No wave of devastation to shatter old orders, no reset button, no reckoning with death on a scale that humbled kings and rattled priests. Instead, the continent calcified, its empires bloated, its faiths hardened, its hierarchy dug in deeper. The colonies in the New World are not children of Enlightenment ideals, because the Enlightenment itself is different. Not born of crisis but of control, not forged by philosophers fleeing from fire and rot, but shaped by academics who never left the cathedral. So here, in this 1776, rebellion stirs not from principles but from desperation. Philadelphia does not smell of revolution. It reeks of smoke, sweat, and soot. Trade guilds whisper in basements. Former indentured servants plot in dockyards. The children of slaves listen at doors. Priests preach loyalty from pulpits while smuggling letters behind altars. There is no declaration of independence. There is only a dozen manifestos, each one torn between monarchy and mutiny. In Boston, a man named Josiah Blackstone, a cobbler's apprentice turned printer, begins publishing a banned pamphlet. It has no title. Its cover is blank, but inside, in ink smuggled from French Quebec, it reads, "The land belongs to no king. The sky bows to no crown, and neither shall we. By winter, 1,000 copies circulate. By spring, it is law to burn them on sight. By summer, reading one can cost you a hand. But ideas once read cannot be unread, and violence once tasted cannot be forgotten. In this America, the rebellion is not organized. There are no uniforms, no Congress, no alliances. There are pockets, embers, bridge without structure, hope without plan. And yet it spreads in the Carolinas. Plantations begin to collapse under the weight of paranoia. Slaves vanish by the hundreds into the swamps. Some form hidden communities. Others ally with disaffected Irish farmers and rogue French traders. They don't call it a revolution. They call it the breaking in Pennsylvania. Quaker meetings splinter. The doctrine of peace fractures under pressure. Some embrace pacifism. Others arm themselves in secret, led by a preacher's son named Levi Rudd, who declares a holy breach with empire. But the British do not wait. They come fast. More troops than in our history. More ships. More steel. Because this empire, never hollowed by plague, never weakened by schism, never softened by reformation, is whole. It is ruthless. It is afraid. Battles flare, cities burn, loyalist colonies tighten their grip, and from the ashes something strange emerges. Not a nation, but an idea. By 1781, the eastern seaboard is a fractured mosaic. Virginia has become a bastion of noble Catholicism, bishops ruling as feudal lords. New England is a cluster of city-states, each governed by its own merchant council, often at war with its neighbors. In the inland valleys, freed slaves, native tribes, and defectors from both sides form communes that reject all European law entirely. There is no United States, there is 1,000 splinters. And in this chaos, Europe watches, not with fear, but with contempt. To them, the colonies have failed, proof that freedom without order breeds savagery. But others see something else. In a tavern in Geneva, a mathematician named Theo Marchand hears a smuggled account of Levi Rudd's militia holding off a battalion of redcoats using nothing but stolen muskets and homemade explosives. He reads of Josiah Blackstone being captured, then vanishing from a prison ship 2 nights later. He hears whispers of the Appalachian Front, where a black woman named Celeste leads a network of spies, saboteurs, and escaped laborers across the mountains. Marchand begins to write, not equations, but verses, poems of fire and frost and freedom. He calls them les éclats, the shards. They spread across Europe like wildfire. In Paris, a young apprentice reads les éclats by candlelight. His name is Lucien. His hands are stained with dye. His dreams are stained with fury. He joins a circle of underground thinkers, machinists, cooks, cobblers, mothers, students. They meet in a bakery basement beneath Rue des Martyrs. They speak of the colonies not as failures, but as warnings, and they ask the question that no one has dared to ask aloud in public since the Great Silence of the 1300s. What if we stop obeying? By 1789, the bread riots begin. Not over taxes, over the church hoarding grain. In our world, the Bastille was stormed as a symbol of royal tyranny. In this world, it is the Abbey of Saint Denis that burns first. and from it revolutionaries drag not nobles but cardinals. Their robes catch fire faster than paper. France erupts, but differently. The monarchy had long since entrenched itself with the church. The two are inseparable, so when one falls, the other implodes. But the revolution has no center, no Robespierre, no Danton, no National Assembly, only cells, networks, echoes. Each region declares its own freedom and its own rules. In Lyon, a commune led by glassmakers refuses to recognize Paris's claim to leadership. In Marseille, a woman named Adrienne Savarin gathers orphans and deserters and forms the Cercle de Lune, a resistance not to kings, but to systems. They wear no flags, only black scarves, and from Corsica comes a name, not of a general, but of a translator. Napoleon Bonaparte. He had once been a surveyor, mapping roads, translating legal codes between dialects. But in 1792, he is asked by 6 different city-states to help draft a treaty. He refuses. Instead, he drafts his own. It is not a treaty, it is a manifesto. It reads, "Europe is not a crown, nor a church, nor a machine. Europe is the breath of those who say no." Napoleon becomes not an emperor, but a courier of rebellion. He travels from city to city, uniting communes, brokering peace, codifying rights. Not all accept him, but many listen. By 1800, the continent is unrecognizable. No Holy Roman Empire, no papal states, no absolute monarchs, only fractured regions, some democratic, some brutal, some idealistic, some monstrous. But alive, uncontained, and across the ocean the Americas evolve in tandem. The Carolinas, once feudal, now fracture into 3 republics, one led by a freedwoman named Sarai, who builds schools in old mansions and turns tobacco fields into community farms. In Quebec, an underground printing press produces maps not of borders but of belief, charts showing where equality is practiced, where tyranny reigns, and where neutrality survives. The term nation has become obsolete. People speak of zones, of clusters, of freedoms. And yet the cost is high. Without a central order, trade is erratic. Famine stalks the edges. Some communes descend into cults, others are wiped out by ambitious warlords. But still, no one returns to the old ways, because in this timeline where the Black Death never reached Europe, the breaking came late, but it came harder, longer, and it burned deeper. As the 19th century dawns, a child named Amélie Fortier, daughter of a blacksmith and a fugitive midwife, writes her first journal entry, hiding in the snow-covered woods outside of Albany. She writes, "I was born into no nation. I bow to no king. I speak no mother tongue, but I dream in fire, and I will not forget." Her words are found 50 years later, etched into a stone wall in a burned-out cabin. They become a hymn, not because they are beautiful, but because they are true. And so this world, untouched by plague, now stands trembling on the edge of a question it was never ready to ask. If we are not what the past made us, then what truly are we becoming? The year is 1810. Europe is no longer ruled. It is navigated. No empires remain intact, no papacies unbroken, no single calendar or currency or creed holds sway across the continent. The monarchies that once stretched like iron across the land have fractured into 1,000 shards. City communes, rural collectives, federated republics, warlord enclaves, and floating councils of artisans, masons, poets, and engineers. What unites them now is movement, because in the absence of central order, the 19th century does not begin with tradition. It begins with velocity. In Paris, or what remains of it, old palaces have been stripped bare. Their marble staircases now echo with the steps of barefoot orphans and itinerant scribes. The Seine glows faintly by night with the reflection of gas lamps, a technology stolen from English inventors and repurposed by anarchist mechanics. In the alleys of Krakow, clockmakers gather, building intricate mechanical brains powered by steam, gears, and intuition. They don't call it science. They call it quiet sorcery. And in northern Italy, a surgeon named Mirko Tovani perfects a technique to remove bullet fragments from the spine. Without killing the patient, he's hailed as a heretic by the old priesthood, and as a miracle worker by everyone else. In this world, without the dead hand of feudal Europe to suppress curiosity, science is not a linear march led by institutions. It is a wildfire, unregulated, dangerous, beautiful. Sometimes it heals. Sometimes it explodes. By 1820, airships drift across the Rhine, stitched together with French linen and heated by Swiss coal. One crashes into a vineyard outside Lyon, igniting an accidental harvest fire. The resulting wine, fermented from smoke-scorched grapes, is bottled and sold as Incendie Rouge. It becomes a symbol of the era, chaotic, potent, unforgettable. In Berlin, a group of exiled Russian scholars, barred from returning home after challenging the Orthodox Council, begin experimenting with lenses. By 1823, they develop a rudimentary camera. The first photograph ever taken in this timeline shows not a portrait, but a riot, a blur of faces, motion, fury. The image is banned in 7 provinces, but everyone wants to see it, and behind all this, something else stirs, not revolution, not invention, but reconciliation, because as the century progresses, humanity begins to look inward, not with fear but with fascination. Philosophers once hunted by church agents now walk freely in the streets of Milan and Marseille, delivering lectures to crowds that spill from balconies and rooftops. They speak not of God or kings or empires, but of mind, memory, and meaning. In 1831, a blind poet named Leora Venek publishes a book titled The Mirror That Dreams. It explores in verse the question, if history does not bind us, what does? It is banned by 36 councils. And read in secret across the world. Meanwhile, the Americas simmer. The fractured colonies have not united, but neither have they dissolved. Instead, they have evolved into what one wandering cartographer calls the drifting nations, the Hudson Syndicate, the Appalachian Confederation, the Coastal Pact, the Mississippi Mirror. Each governs in its own way. Some are liberal havens, others are mercantile strongholds, a few are theocratic nightmares, but most are trying, failing, rebuilding, trying again. The descendants of the rebellion, children of escapees and idealists, begin to ask what comes after survival, what comes after fury, what comes after fire. In 1837, an aging Levi Rudd, once the radical preacher, now a quiet farmer, delivers a final sermon beneath a shattered oak tree. We broke the crown, we shattered the cross, but we never asked what fills the silence. The time has come to listen, not to power, not to pride, but to one another. He dies the next winter, and his funeral is attended by former enemies. Not far away, a girl named Elsie Fortier, granddaughter of Amelie, whose Fireborn journal once echoed through rebel camps, writes a letter to a friend in the far south. She has never seen a king, never heard Latin, never learned the words to any national anthem. But she writes, there is something here, not unity, not peace, but possibility. I think we are becoming something. I don't yet know what, but I feel it when I walk under the stars. And that feels like enough. Her letter is never published, but in time it is found, carried, carved into the walls of an academy in what will someday be called Sao Paulo. Because the world has not become better. It has become stranger, freer, fiercer, and the Black Death, that ancient plague that never came, now haunts history not as a horror avoided, but as a silence that reshaped everything without it. There was no purge, no humbling, no forced humility, and so humanity had to choose its own humility, the hard way, step by brutal step. In the shadows of these broken empires, something else begins to rise, not ideology, not conquest, but art. The last third of the 19th century becomes something no one expected, a renaissance, not born from gold or power or imperial patronage, but from hunger and longing and the quiet aching need to understand a world that never paused. The year is 1860. Steam has begun to whisper its power across continents, not in thick black plumes that choked London in our timeline, not through factories like fortresses or cities built for coal, but in slender vessels on rivers, in clever engines drawn by artisans, in scattered hubs of innovation untouched by the greed of monopolies or empires. The Black Death never came, and so the industrial world, while still inevitable, has taken another shape. Less explosive, more intricate, like a vine rather than a tower, in the port city of New Norwich, built atop the ruins of an abandoned British outpost in what we would call New England. A cluster of rogue engineers have reimagined propulsion. They do not work for kings or companies. They answer only to curiosity. Their rail cars whisper along tracks with brass fins and silent magnets, not bound by coal, but moved by the chemical distillate of sugarcane and algae. The scent of seaweed and citrus follows them down every line. At their helm is a once-orphaned mechanic named Juniper Hale, who speaks 7 languages and keeps blueprints etched into her skin with ash ink. She speaks of motion as harmony and teaches street children to build engines with spoons, wires, and patience. She will later be called the mother of smooth travel. Across the Atlantic, in the mountain ranges of the Sonnenkreis, once Bavaria, a peculiar thinker by the name of Halbrecht Fallner constructs the world's first whisper engine, a magnetic turbine that moves without sound or smoke. It runs on motion, polarity, and silence. Fallner lives alone. He eats stones warmed by fire and reads aloud to birds. He does not publish, but he opens his gates, and the world comes to him. Tinkerers from Napoli, sculptors from Anatolia, alchemists from the Levant, they all descend on his hillside to learn from this mute machine. Within a decade, 1,000 versions bloom across the continent, but no single nation claims the patent, because there are no nations as we knew them. Not here, Without the Black Death, the centralizing power of monarchies never reached its apogee. The chaos that followed the plague in our world, with power vacuums, consolidation, and hard crowns, never arrived. The great absolutist states were stillborn. Instead, human society branched and braided like a delta. City leagues, guild republics, matrilineal communes, oceanic federations, each with its own rhythm, its own rules. Some traded freely, others shut their gates, but none became empires. And so when machines arrived, there was no singular industrial revolution. There were dozens simultaneous, local, wildly diverse. In the Saharan edge, nomadic builders craft turbine tents, collapsible domes that catch desert wind and power internal mills for weaving, light and cooling. Their ancestors once herded goats, now they herd energy. In the riverbanks of Bengal, floating farms merge agriculture with solar ceramics. Crops are rotated based on flood patterns, and every farm is paired with a school and a songhouse. In the Chilean heights, mountain bridges shimmer with copper conductors that draw static from air and lightning, a process discovered accidentally by a teenage shepherdess named Isadora Kunz, who simply asked, "Why does the mountain hum?" But not all hums are harmonious. The Americas, divided not by colonial borders, but by resource zones and philosophical factions, begin to buckle under contradiction. The Mississippi Mirror, a vast delta collective once founded on shared labor, open land, and equitable yields, now faces pressure from rising landholders. Not conquerors, but speculators. Not swords, but contracts. They arrive with maps, ledgers, promises. They bring gold from the salt mines of the Arkansas crust. They offer loans, generous at first, but default becomes inevitable. And then, land changes hands. Entire collectives wake up one day to find that the ground they tend no longer belongs to them. Not because of war, because of ink. Protests arise, not of fists, but of logic. A former textile codebreaker named Rani Biswas, exiled from the Bengal Confederation for challenging harvest quotas, writes a treatise called The Pattern of Extraction. In it, she demonstrates mathematically and linguistically that unregulated accumulation leads to systemic imbalance, collapse not just of economy, but of meaning. Her equations spread like wildfire, not through books, but through hands. Graffiti equations appear on tenements in Sao Paulo, in chalk on bridges in Morocco, carved into ice in northern Finland. The math becomes a language of resistance. In Florence, a street sweeper named Lorenzo della Neve paints an entire boulevard with one of Biswas' formulas using crushed charcoal, flour, and wine. Rain washes it away. By evening, the same equation reappears in 50 cities. This is no revolution of arms. It is a revolution of comprehension. People begin to see money as flow, labor as heat, power as compression. The old kings, now merely wealthy, find themselves surrounded by people who can read the machinery they once exploited. And yet, old habits do not die cleanly. To the Eurasian north, in the frozen steppes of Veliki Rus, a last tsardom remains. A glacial empire of ritual and frost. It has survived not by war but by isolation. Within its towering onion domes and sacred stone citadels, the Orthodox crown enforces obedience through silence and scripture. They speak of purity. They speak of chosen blood. They speak of snow that must not melt, but snow cannot hold back time. A boy named Mikhail, son of a chimney builder, carves letters into birch bark with a broken nail. His first sentence is, "Truth melts snow." His sister, caught teaching band poems, disappears in the night. He runs, south, toward the locus, because far to the west, on an artificial island between Sicily and Tunisia, something has risen. A monument, a miracle, a memory, the locus. A global library, built not by nations but by consensus. A floating citadel of knowledge, designed to have no borders, no soldiers, no flag. It stores seeds, languages, prototypes, lullabies. It listens more than it speaks, and in 1872 a gathering begins. Not a congress of diplomats, not a war council, but a convergence. People arrive by reed ship, by glider, by foot. Philosophers from the Masai Ridge, engineers from the Mekong Peaks, healers from the Iroquois Peace Ring, architects from the Andes. They sit in a hall with no ceiling, above them stars, before them a single question written in 37 tongues. What now? No one answers at first. But then a woman from Alexandria, aged 83, stands. Her voice shakes, her eyes do not. Now we begin to grow sideways, not upward, not against, but with. The room does not erupt in applause, it nods, and something changes. Shared infrastructures emerge, neutral communication protocols, open-source shipping routes, transcultural education networks, voluntary intercalendrical timekeeping. They are not laws, they are invitations, but not all accept. In the Anatolian mountains, a charismatic warlord named Umre Kalun denounces the locus as heresy. He claims it stores forbidden relics, secrets stolen from his ancestors. He rallies the bitter, the isolated, the displaced, and in 1885 he strikes. The locust burns, not entirely, but enough. 7 days of ash, 7 days of mourning. The world watches, not with rage, but with grief. In Athens, a barefoot procession of elders marches without banners. In Kinshasa, schoolchildren lie silently in the streets. In Kyoto, 1,000 paper cranes are lifted into the dawn sky. No leader commands it, no voice narrates it, but everywhere, a pause, a breath, a shared ache. For the first time, the world feels like one body, and in its wound, something is born. A new century rises, not clean, not united, but aware of itself, of its contradictions, of its quiet, trembling potential. In the year 1900, a girl named Mina, age 9, stands atop the rebuilt tower of the locust. She watches ships arriving with reed sails and copper wings. She wears a robe stitched with 20 flags, none of them national. She writes in her journal, "We're not waiting for the future anymore. We are folding it, like paper, and sending it back to ourselves. The century ahead will be vast and dangerous, and filled with songs. But it will not be owned." The year is 1901. There is no British Empire, no Habsburgs, no German Reich, no Ottoman remnant. The crowns that once weighed upon the heads of Europe have long since rusted away, or been melted down into clockwork parts and railway rivets. The great powers of our world never solidified in this one, and without them, the age of conquest gave way not to peace but to something far more intricate. Entanglement. Across the planet, a web hums. It is not made of steel, or cables, or laws, but of exchanges, of ideas, inventions, stories, and silent understandings. There are conflicts, yes, but not the kind waged in trenches, not yet. Instead, war in this century has become a whisper, a duel of minds, a contest of meaning. In the equatorial forests of Congo, Angola, a scholar known only as Taba launches a campaign against what she calls chronodominance, the theft of temporal memory by more dominant cultures. She unearths oral histories, refutes European timelines, and proves with song, symbol, and carbon ink that the calendar itself is a colonial weapon. Her ideas spread faster than fire. By 1908, entire city leagues begin to adopt dual calendar systems, one solar, one ancestral. Children learn to tell time in heartbeats, migrations, and rains. Time is no longer one line, it is a braid. In Samarkand, beneath turquoise domes etched with poetry, a different battle is underway. The synesthetic schools, a network of polyphonic academies, begin blending disciplines into sensory education. Mathematics is taught through rhythm and motion, philosophy through taste and architecture, chemistry through light. They believe the Enlightenment was too narrow. They call this movement the Bloom. Its leader, a blind philosopher named Ori Mir, once dreamed in 7 colors. Now she teaches sighted students how to think in silence. And then in 1913, a whisper turns into a rupture. Not a war, but a disappearance. An entire floating university, the Mantis Ark, vanishes in the Indian Ocean. It had been traveling between knowledge hubs, housing thinkers from 38 territories. Among them, machine coders from Jakarta, mythologists from Nubia, cloud cartographers from the Andes. One morning, the Ark sends a final message: we have seen it. The edge, the mirror, the end, and then nothing, no wreckage, no debris, just silence. The world is shaken. Mourning ceremonies sweep across continents, but they are not funerals. They are promises. In response, 3,000 vessels set sail, not to search for the Ark but to continue its mission. They call themselves the Wake, a flotilla of floating schools, roving hospitals, observatories, art barges, soil labs. No borders, no nations, only paths. By 1920, the Wake has become the world's largest knowledge exchange, a perpetual oceanic migration, cross-pollinating the planet with ideas too fragile for static cities. And so, without war, the 20th century begins not in blood, but in velocity. But not everyone wants speed. In the dry plains of the Chaco Basin, a spiritual order emerges that preaches stillness, the order of the held breath. They believe motion is decay, that the world has spun too fast since the death of death. Their monasteries forbid clocks. Their robes are woven from moss. They believe the Black Death, though it never came, still echoes in our blood as a hunger for control, a fear of chaos, a need to outpace mortality. To them, peace means stillness, permanence. The soil, and their sermons grow louder. Conflicts begin to bubble, not of bullets but of meanings. In 1924, a kinetic sculpture titled The Falling Tower is installed in the locus. It depicts a constantly collapsing spire rebuilt by invisible hands every hour. Visitors either weep or scream. Some stay for days, others leave enraged. A week later, an anti-locust faction bombs the memory chamber in Caracas, destroying half a century of recordings. For the first time in this century, the question is asked, what if connection is the real enemy? By 1930, isolationist communes begin to appear. the cedar wallers of the Pacific Northwest, the auric sanctum in Tibet, the new stillborns in Siberia, a society that attempts to recreate a pre-plague medievalism, complete with leech healing and forbidden printing presses. They fail. Some collapse into madness, others become frozen museums. But the fractures signal something deeper, a restlessness, a fear that the world has grown too stained to recognize, and so inevitably someone tries to restore order. In 1933, from the limestone arcologies of northwestern Africa, a charismatic orator rises. His name is Sefu Amani, a self-proclaimed harmonizer. He speaks not of race or nation, but of narrative. We are tangled. Too many stories, too many clocks. I offer one story, one rhythm, one will. At first he is laughed off. But Amani is patient. He doesn't raise armies, he raises metronomes, literal ones. He sends them to villages, communes, towers, ticking in perfect unison. He calls it the pulse. Within 5 years, half of Western Eurasia has synchronized to the pulse. Festivals, harvests, work, sex, death, all on schedule. No more drift, no more surprise, just unity. But unity has a price. Dissidents begin to vanish, not killed, rewritten. Their words altered by pulse editors, their movements erased from public maps. Some still live, but they are called by different names with different pasts. Reality begins to warp, not through force, through formatting. And so the locus responds, not with weapons, with memory. In 1940, the first Truth Chorus performs live in 7 cities simultaneously. Each singer holds a divergent memory. Together they weave contradictions into a single harmonic braid. Audible to anyone within earshot, it causes nausea in some, ecstasy in others. The pulse declares the performance a virus. The singers disappear within a week, but their song, the discordant hymn, becomes the most replicated melody of the century. And so a new kind of war begins, not hot, not cold, but resonant. It is a war of frequencies, of rhythms, of who gets to decide the tempo of truth. Across rainforests and deserts, undersea domes and drifting isles, people begin to tune themselves. Some to the pulse, others to something older, wilder, plural. A child in Patagonia programs a stone to hum in her sleep. A monk in Myanmar reactivates a temple to radiate dreams of past lives. A street dancer in Cairo encodes history into footwork. A radio host in Iceland broadcasts raw, unedited conversations with strangers 24 hours a day. And beneath it all, the question echoes, what story are we inside of? By 1950, the pulse fractures. Not by force, by music, because music cannot be censored. It can only be drowned or heard. In an empty coliseum in Anatolia, the last pulse harmonizer stands alone. His metronome breaks, he weeps, not because he lost, but because he never danced. The world dances now. It is not clean, it is not easy. But it is alive, and the Black Death, still absent, still silent, still looming in some alternate timeline, remains the absence that defined the presence. Without it, humanity did not bow. It did not rebuild under empire. It wandered, wove, clashed, composed, and now, halfway through the 20th century, it stands not unified but awake. The year is 1961. There are no nuclear arsenals, no Berlin Wall, no Cuban Missile Crisis, no superpower standoff. The Cold War never came, but something colder did, not war, but isolation. Because as the world raced toward complexity, clocks synchronized, voices harmonized, timelines fractured and braided, something was quietly lost. Touch, not physical but emotional. Intimacy began to fray, in the absence of a unifying terror like World War. Societies turned inward, not to heal, but to observe, to curate, to fragment. By 1965, the locus is no longer a place. It is a stream, a living archive of the entire planet's memory, accessible by anyone with a mirror link, a quantum coil of refracted knowledge and perspective. At first, it is celebrated. Children in Nigeria debate dialectics with grandmothers in Osaka. A dancer in Buenos Aires mimics the hand gestures of a Yakutian storyteller. A group of 7-year-olds in Morocco choreograph an entire opera using only dream logs recorded by monks in Sumatra. It feels like magic. It feels like utopia. But utopias have shadows. By 1972, a new condition begins to spread. It has no name, no pathogen, no borders. It manifests in stillness, in silence. People begin to withdraw, not from others, but from themselves. They stop expressing desire. They stop finishing sentences. They begin to observe their own lives. As if through glass, it becomes known as the looking. Some say it's caused by too much reflection, too many memories, too many perspectives, too many realities layered upon the self. Others say it's the soul's way of defending itself, of pausing before drowning. Either way, entire communities begin to freeze. The pulse had failed, but in its place, something colder has emerged. not enforced rhythm, but endless reference, and in the wake of this paralysis a question rises like smoke: what happens when we know everything but feel nothing? Enter the Scorchers, a decentralized movement, part theater, part therapy, part rebellion. They wear no symbols, carry no weapons, their only tactic interruption. They storm public concerts and scream lullabies. They flood locust streams with improvised nonsense. They rewrite entire architectural blueprints with emotional descriptions. The walls should feel like grief, the stairwell must echo longing. They aren't artists, they are combustion. Their leader, if she can be called that, is a woman named Tomei. Born in the Free Keys of Cartagena, she once erased her entire identity from the locus and lived unnamed for 7 years. She returns with a single message: burn the map, breathe the forest. Her philosophy catches fire, literally. In 1976, thousands gather in the salt flats of northern Persia and build a temporary city with no roads, no clocks, no mirrors. They call it the Ash Communion. Every night they destroy part of it. Every morning they rebuild. By the third year, 1 million people attend. The world calls them mad. They call themselves warm. But not all responses are so gentle. In the Arctic threshold, a vertical territory of stacked settlements spanning from Iceland to Siberia, an opposing movement emerges: the Glassword. They reject warmth, reject subjectivity. Their creed is clarity. Their goal, absolute transparency of thought, record, and memory. They begin to develop neurointerfaces that record emotions in real time, not for reflection but for correction. They believe suffering is a data glitch. Their leader, YLL Sundaran, delivers a message across all northern wavelengths: the age of ambiguity is over. Let no lie survive. Let no echo repeat. We must clean the mirror or drown in its distortion. And so the world splits, not along borders or ideologies, but along feelings: warmth versus clarity, fire versus ice. Not a cold war, a quiet burn. In 1983 a breakthrough occurs. Not in technology but in consensus collapse. For the first time, the locus fails to reconcile a narrative. An event in the central step, the simultaneous death and survival of a poet named André Sula, becomes irreconcilable. Two timelines form, two entirely consistent memories. Neither can disprove the other. The locus doesn't crash, it fractures. A digital schism. Overnight, two divergent reality streams emerge. They are called the trace and the vow. The trace prioritizes lineage, continuity, collective agreement. It preserves the memory of Sula's death. The vow embraces recursion, personal experience, emotional resonance. It upholds his survival. Each becomes its own universe, each with its own art, ethics, language drift, and for a time people choose. Some live in the trace, others in the vow. Each believe their world is the one that remained. But slowly, inevitably, the membranes begin to leak. In 1990, a phenomenon known as memory bleed begins. Individuals who cross between streams report déjà vu, phantom emotions, impossible knowledge. Some collapse, others transcend. A new generation is born, called the Glimmers. They remember both versions of events, all versions. They are not prophets, they are fractures in human form. The world is now more connected than ever, and more unstable than ever. The final decade of the 20th century is known as the Shimmer Age, not for its light, but for its trembling, its uncertainty. Borders dissolve into context. Identity becomes a mosaic. Children are raised by collectives of nonlinear mentors: a grandmother from the trace, a sibling from the vow, a teacher from the Ash Communion. Truth is not abandoned. It is multiplied, and somewhere in a coastal cavern off what was once called Ireland, a child named Senna writes the following words into the sand: "The world is a song we forgot we were singing. But I remember both verses and the silence between. The tide takes her message. But others will write it again, in different tongues, different hands. The 20th century ends not with a bang, not with a wall falling, but with a mirror being turned inward, and a whisper, what now?" The year is 2001. No towers fall, no planes are hijacked, no televised terror scorches the morning sky, but something else does, something silent, something older. It begins in the vow stream, a cascade of inconsistent echoes. Emotional bleed intensifies. People wake from dreams that don't belong to them. They cry for families they never had, laugh at jokes they never heard. They begin to fragment, not physically, but ontologically. In a village in what was once northern Anatolia, a man named Elion wakes up fluent in a language no one has ever spoken. He writes its grammar in a single afternoon. The alphabet is curved, recursive, almost melodic. He calls it Kareth, the language of unborn memory. Within a month, children across 7 locus nodes begin speaking it spontaneously. The trace authorities are alarmed. They send lexicographers, philosophers, neural tacticians. None of it helps. Because Kareth isn't a code, it's a feeling, a grammar of intuition, a syntax of loss. And it spreads like wildfire, not through speech but through silence, through the spaces between other words, between glances, between remembered dreams and forgotten futures. 2001 ends with a whisper, not of terror but of recognition. The streams are converging, not politically, not physically, but metaphysically. By 2007, a new generation comes of age, born across streams, fluent in both trace and vow, emotionally fluent in Kareth. They are called the thresholders. They do not lead, they anchor. In every city you'll find them. Quiet, strange-eyed, unfazed by paradox, they drift between contradiction like dancers between notes. They do not seek power, they seek coherence. But coherence is hard to hold, because in the absence of a singular history, of world wars, of imperial scars, of unifying crises, humanity has not lost its violence. It has simply scattered it. Micro-civil wars erupt, not over land or ideology, but over meaning, over which memories deserve to be preserved, over which selves are most real. In the archipelago once known as the Philippines, rival memory guilds clash over emotional archives. Thousands perish in a war of curation. In northern Africa, sophist technologists construct vaults of quiet, sonic sanctuaries where no memory is allowed to enter. When breached, the vaults shatter minds. In Greenland, a group of nomads who call themselves the Stillborn declare independence, not from any government but from time. They refuse linear calendars, refuse locust feeds. They walk only at dusk and sleep only when it rains. Their anthem is one line, endlessly repeated: we do not move forward, we spiral inward. And all the while, the glimmers, the generation who remember too much, begin to fade, not into death, into something stranger. In 2020 they begin disappearing, not literally, but narratively. They vanish from memory logs, from visual archives, from emotional streams. Their names evaporate mid-sentence. You ask about them and get static or laughter, or an ache behind the eyes. Only one place remembers them. A single, radiant structure at the edge of the Pacific, the vault of witnessing. No one knows who built it, no one guards it, but everyone feels it. Inside there are no recordings, only rooms. Each room holds a memory, and inside each memory a story, and inside each story a version of you. Visitors report visions, smells from their childhood, arguments they never had, hugs from long-dead friends, versions of their lives they were never brave enough to live. Some return, some stay, some forget they ever entered. The world continues, not as a singular arc but as a web. By 2029, humanity has stopped trying to unify. Instead, they learn to braid. Cultures now intertwine like rivers, not assimilating but harmonizing. Music becomes the primary medium of diplomacy. Nations dissolve into resonance clusters. Identity is no longer declared, it is performed. Every person carries a chord, it changes as they do, but not all embrace this symphony. A resistance forms, not fundamentalist, not fascist, not nationalist, but narrativist. They believe reality must choose a path. They call themselves the spine. Their emblem, a tree with one root, one trunk, and only one branch. Their creed, too many stories fracture the soul. Truth must narrow, truth must cut. They do not bomb, they do not shoot. They edit. They surgically remove conflicting memories from public logs. They release simplified timelines, clean biographies, linear arcs. They make reality digestible. And the world begins to eat. By 2034, 2/3 of locust clusters rely on spine-curated history. It is efficient, comforting, deadly, because with every contradiction erased, something vital is lost. Wonder, the ache of mystery, the warmth of ambiguity, the thrill of not knowing if your past is true but loving it anyway. And so a rebellion forms, not in arms, in story. In 2036, a woman named Rosa Shun releases a song called What If We Never Agreed. It is 1 minute long. It contains only 7 words. You are true, I am too. It becomes the most echoed melody in human history, not because of its harmony, because of its permission. By 2040, children begin to ask a new question. What story do you want to live? Not what is true, not what happened, but what feels real to you. And so, humanity becomes a garden of realities, layered, shared, clashing, dancing. A world with no singular past, no definite trauma, no central myth. Only a spiral of voices, each singing, each listening, each shimmering with a truth that might only ever belong to them. And somewhere in the floating city once known as Venice, now rebuilt atop interlocking biospheres, a thresholder named Mara whispers to a child, "The Black Death never came, so we had to die in smaller ways, over and over, until we learned how to be whole." The child asks, "Are we whole now?" Mara smiles, shakes her head. No, but we're learning how to be shattered, without being lost. The year is 2081, there is no war, no border patrols, no nuclear standoff, no mass extinction. The sea levels have not risen, the atmosphere, though warmer, remains breathable. There are no megacities choked with smoke, no planet-wide famine, no collapse. But peace has not brought joy, it has brought quiet. A strange, vast quiet, not empty, but watchful, like the silence after a symphony where no one claps because no one knows if it's truly over. The locus, once a stream, once a network, once a memory, is now embodied, not in devices, in people. They are called the weaveborn. Human minds augmented not by implants or code, but by narrative, trained from infancy in multiplicity, contrast, resonance, able to feel 1,000 lives without fracture. They do not walk through life, they glide through meaning, and yet something trembles beneath them. In the mountain cities of what was once the Andes, an old archivist named Ewan keeps a ritual. Every morning he lights a small fire. Every morning he burns a single memory, one that doesn't belong to him. A child's song, a stranger's sorrow, a wedding he never attended, a death he never caused. He calls it grief tending. And every night, villagers come and sit around the ashes. They speak softly, not about what was lost, but what was never real to begin with. It is the most honest place on earth. By 2090, stories are no longer told to explain the world. They are told to hold it. Like hands holding water. Like voices holding silence. Then, in a place once called Mongolia, on the golden skin of a prairie untouched by map or grid, a girl is born. Her name is Elia. She does not speak until age 5. When she does, her first sentence is, "Something is missing." Not what, not who, something. By age 12 she begins building, not machines, not models, but maps of silence, cartographies of absence. She walks across continents gathering stories of things that never happened, empires that were never born, sorrows that never rippled, the memory of a war that never started, the ghost of a cry that was never heard. She becomes a myth, a living archive of what might have been. By 2097, she disappears. No body, no data, only a final message carved in stone found atop the oldest glacier still left. We are not the ones who survived. We are the ones who were spared. The difference is everything. And then, the sky changes. A signal, not alien, not divine, human, from a station thought long dead, drifting near the edge of the Kuiper Belt. A station built in 2065 to monitor cosmic anomalies, abandoned after budget collapse, empty for over 20 years. Until now, the signal is short, 12 seconds, a single voice speaking Kareth, the emotion language of forgotten selves. Experts transcribe, analyze, debate, but a child, only 5 years old, listens once and begins to weep. She translates it in a whisper. You have forgotten something, but it remembers you. The world holds its breath. What was forgotten? A person, a war, a god, a version of the earth that once was, and now waits. Search missions are launched, not military, not political pilgrimages. By 2102, a new movement emerges, the Rememberers. They do not seek conquest or colonization or knowledge, they seek the forgotten. They travel not in ships but in stories. Encoded into light, they are cast across the galaxy, seeded into particles, echoes, gravity wells. A symphony of selves, of lost possibilities, sent into the void. Each carries one question: what if you're still out there, back on Earth? Something changes. People begin, quieting, not withdrawing, listening, to silence, to memory, to that ancient space before history, when the world was not yet named. In 2110, a girl is born in the Arctic bloom, the floating gardens of what was once the Bering Strait. She is blind, but she paints, and every canvas she makes depicts the same scene. A gathering of people, all ages, all times, holding hands in a circle around a fire that is not fire but light. When asked where she learned it, she smiles and says, "It's from before, from the story before the stories." No one knows what it means, but they recognize the feeling, the ache of something lost and finally found. It is not a prophecy, not a revelation, just a moment, a breath, a beginning. Because in a world where the Black Death never came, where humanity was never culled, never traumatized into modernity, never forged by fire, something else was forged. Not empire, not order, not even peace, but possibility. A wild, trembling, ever-braided possibility, where meaning matters more than certainty, where stories are not corrections, but companions, where we are not bound by what happened, but invited by what might. And in the final scene we see the earth, blue, breathing, boundless, not perfect, but awake, a world that never burned, but still learned how to shine. If that made you feel something, follow the voice. There are more stories waiting.